All right, so today we're going to be turning to another case study, and the case study today is about the Benin Bronzes and the issue of cultural property and contested ownership. So before we start, I just wanted to put a disclaimer out there, namely that I'm not an expert in African art, but I am very much interested in, or maybe even without sounding my own horn too much, an expert in thinking about how museums present knowledge and how that is tied into Germany's colonial project. So I'm coming at this not so much as someone who has thought greatly about the Benin Bronzes as artifacts in and of themselves, but as someone who's interested in the ways in which these particular artifacts have been collected and displayed. And now what's sort of the after story. So today's case study is different from what we were looking at yesterday, because in this case, the provenance is undisputed. We know where they originated and we know exactly how they came into museum collections. So here today at stake really is the question of repatriation. And remember, in laying out the groundwork on Wednesday, repatriation is the return of art objects or cultural heritage or artifacts to a nation rather than an individual. So the question that we are really thinking about today, and that has been hotly debated in the last 10 years or so in relation to the Benin Bronzes specifically, is the question whether or not these cultural objects should go back to their source country. In April of 2021, so very recently, the German government announced that it would return what they termed substantial number of artifacts known as the Benin Bronzes from all of its federal museums to the Nigerian government. And this announcement really made headlines in the news because it was a significant step forward in an ongoing debate and a really high-profile struggle over the return of stolen objects to their rightful owners. And as we've seen over the past 2 days, the term rightful is really a complicated one and a heavily loaded one because it embodies a collision of ethical and legal judgments. So rightful, who's the rightful owner is really, as I said, quite complicated. There is sort of the moral question in what we were talking about yesterday with the Holocaust victims and the Nazi looting. And then there is the legal question of rightful title. In the case of the German Benin Bronzes, they are being repatriated to the Nigerian government rather than to the heirs of the Oba of Benin, from whom they were looted, or the Oba, the king of Benin. So they are going back to the Nigerian government, not to the Oba of Benin. And that's significant, as you will find out in a moment. The Benin Bronzes are scattered through museums and private collections across the world. And German museums, the ones that are funded by the state, so the federal museums, the big museums in Berlin and in Munich and in Hamburg, for example, own, or are, let's rephrase it, are in the possession of about 100 bronzes. And Germany is the first national government to commit to a return of these artifacts with an actual timetable attached. And the first returns will take place next year in 2022. And this is especially significant for Germany because these particular objects were intended to play a star role in the recently opened Humboldt Forum in Berlin. And I'm showing you here the Humboldt Forum, which is, hang on, I have a pointer. This is the Humboldt Forum right here, designed by the architect Franco Stella, and it is attached to the rebuilt or reimagined or sort of historicist pastiche of the palace that is right across from the Museum Island in Berlin. And again, I'm sorry, I don't have time to go into it, but that project in and of itself has raised a lot of debate in the press. So the Humboldt Forum is this cultural institution here with a large museum of world art in it. And the Benin Bronzes were supposed to be one of the highlights of this large project in Berlin. It is the intention to house most of these Benin bronzes from German collections in the Edo Museum of African Art in Benin City. And some are to remain in Germany, but their ownership, their legal ownership, will clearly be transferred to Nigeria. Now, the Museum of West African Art in Benin City is not built yet, and you probably know much more about this than me, but the London-based Ghanaian and British architect David Ajay designed the museum on behalf of the Legacy Restoration Trust, which is a group that represents the Nigerian government, regional authorities, and the Royal Court of Benin. Now, some of you might be familiar with his work. He's a very high-profile architect because he actually designed the wonderful National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. that opened in 2016. I'm showing you a slide of it, a photograph of it in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. And the museum that is intended for the West African art in Benin City plans to showcase at least 300 Benin bronzes that are drawn from, ideally drawn from 10 major European museums, such as the Humboldt in Vienna, the Weltmuseum, the Humboldt in Berlin, the Weltmuseum in Vienna, the Dutch National Museum of World Cultures, and importantly, the Quai Branly in Paris. And the Paris objects will initially be on loan for 3 years. And then the Parisians hope to establish a satellite museum in West Africa that's modeled on the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. So a similar idea. So the Louvre is the mother institution, and you have the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, and the same idea is with the Quai Branly being the mother institution, with having a satellite museum in West Africa. So a bit more murky than the plans by the German museum, by the Humboldt. Okay, so let's have a look. I thought it might be interesting to just give us a sense of what the Benin bronzes actually are, what some of the controversies around these bronzes are, both now with the repatriation, but also going right back to when they first came into European collections. So the Benin bronzes, the largest number of them are in Britain. And the situation in Britain is a little bit more complicated, and you will have noticed in my listing of the sort of key players who will send Benin bronzes back to Nigeria, I have not listed the British Museum as one of them, or any other museum from the UK. So in Britain at the moment, there are about 1,000 objects, Benin bronzes, that were brought back to Britain from the Ober's Palace in 1897, 1898. And the British Museum, in and of itself, kept around 250 of these artifacts, and the others were distributed across other museums in the country. And here we go, here it becomes a little bit complicated because the objects, the artifacts are either owned by individual institutions. So the Horniman Museum in London, for example, has 49 items from Benin City. And actually they recently declared that they would consider, and I quote here, a possible return of any item in its collection that was taken by force or theft, unquote. So that was a sort of blanket statement around any sort of objects in their collection. And as you'll see, the Benin Bronzes certainly fall into that category of having been taken by force. So they're either owned by these individual institutions or they're owned by national collections, such as the British Museum, which is regulated by Parliament and cannot actually return items from its collection without a change in law. The British Museum has acknowledged that the bronzes were taken in circumstances of, quote, devastation and plunder, unquote, and also is quite emphatic, pardon me, is quite emphatic about making that clear, that they are explaining that in the gallery panels and on the museum website. The British Museum also wants it to be known in these discussions around whether or not the Benin bronzes should be repatriated, that they are actually partially funding a large archaeological project to excavate the site of the plant museum that I just showed you and other parts of Benin City to uncover ancient remains, including parts of the city walls. You see, this is sort of starting to turn into quite a complex debate. And if you're interested in the sort of more detailed outline of the debate that goes beyond what I can present in the next 45 minutes or so, there are two very good recent books that I can recommend. The one on the left is by Barnaby Phillips, and it's called Loot, Britain and the Benin Bronzes. And that book offers a very detailed reconstruction of the history of the original looting in 1897 and the subsequent debates really throughout the 20th century. The book on the right by the curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, Dan Hicks, is not taking quite as sort of historically objective a position, and it is an emphatic argument presenting a strong case for the return of the Benin Bronzes. And as you can see by the title, The Brutish Museum, he is very keen to unveil the ways in which museums were historically and continue to be embroiled in colonialism and racism. So his is much more of a, what's the word should I say, he's taking a very strong political position, versus Barnaby Phillips is much more of a historical account. He's a journalist at the end of the day. All right, so let's have a quick look at the historical context of these artifacts, these beautiful things currently housed in museums all across Europe and some in North America. Now, first of all, the Benin bronzes are not actually from Benin, and I'm sorry, you probably all know this, but I just thought it might be worthwhile mentioning that. But they are from the ancient kingdom of Benin that is now, as you well know, in southern Nigeria. They are also not made of bronze, even though we call them the Benin bronzes. The artifacts that we know as the Benin bronzes are covering quite a diverse set of materials. So they are intricately carved elephant tusks and ivories, as you can see right here. They are wooden sculptures, they're ceramic, they're brass busts. You can see that right here. The brass busts specifically have been taken from the shrines of dead kings, as well as the probably most famous brass plaques. There's a few of them right here that depict the life at court and that were once mounted on the pillars of Benin's royal palace. All of the artifacts that we're categorizing or putting into the Benin Bronzes sort of heading or sub, category have been dated to go back to the 16th and 17th centuries. And they record daily life in the kingdom. They are portraits, they are representations of animals, of hunting and battle scenes, and as I already mentioned, court life in general. So these are, if you just think about the iconography of these brass plaques in and of themselves, you can see how important a cultural picture they transmit of life in the 16th and 17th century at the royal court. The Benin Empire or the Edo Kingdom flourished between the 13th and 19th centuries. And the Europeans first made contact in the late 15th century through Portuguese merchants. That was then followed by Dutch, Danish, and British trading companies who moved in as the slave trade expanded. And the coast was actually often referred to as the slave coast from about the early 17th century onwards because of the large number of slaves that were shipped to the New World during the transatlantic slave trade. And after the abolition of slavery by Britain and its attempt to enforce anti-slavery laws, Benin became an important source of palm oil and rubber. It also exported ivory. And in return for these products, the Oba was supplied with guns and copper and brass bracelets. And the copper and brass bracelets either served as a currency or they were melted down to be turned into these beautiful Benin bronzes, the brass bronzes that we are looking at, and the plaques. Sorry, the history lesson is almost over, but I need to set this all up for us to really understand why the debate is what it is today. So in 1884-85, as you well know, the so-called Berlin Conference, or sometimes also known as the Congo Conference, took place in Berlin. And this was, of course, the event that notoriously realigned European colonial holdings and trade in Africa. The British Protectorate was established in the Niger Delta. And in 1896, the local British Council reported to London that the Oba had placed a tax on palm kernels. And as I said, palm oil was one of the most profitable products coming out of Benin, the Benin Kingdom. And the Oba had also declared that anybody who was caught continuing to trade in palm kernels was to be punished by death. That led to a British mission under General James Phillips to set off and negotiate. But that mission was ambushed on the 4th of January 1897 and has entered history as the so-called Benin Massacre. And on the left, I'm showing you an engraving that circulated in the British popular press of that event. During this ambush, 7 British officials were killed and 200 African porters. Only 2 survivors made it out of there. Now, the problem with this mission was that it was a completely unofficial mission, so it wasn't government sanctioned, and there wasn't permission given by the Foreign Office to go in and start discussions or negotiations with the OBA. So historians to this very day are not quite sure what Phillips was actually trying to achieve. However, the retaliation was swift and brutal. The British retaliated by mounting a punitive expedition, and it's often still known as such, the punitive expedition of February 1897. So they mounted a punitive expedition under Admiral Harry Rawson of the Royal Navy's Cape Town Squadron in, as I said, February of 1897. And during this punitive expedition, the British took Benin City and set up their headquarters in the Ober's palace. And this is when monuments and the palaces of high-ranking chiefs were looted. Soon, gruesome stories about what the British had encountered when they entered the city began to circulate in the British press. And the content of these stories was that the Oba had sacrificed hundreds of slaves and captives to appease his family gods. And so this was then seen as really given justification and permission to plundering and looting, which began. Homes, religious buildings, and palaces were looted and then deliberately torched. And the Oba himself, the Oba himself was exiled. The justification that the British gave, of course, was that the looting of these valuable objects was justified to cover the cost of the campaign. But this soon turned really into a free-for-all. And I'm just showing you some historical photographs here. I'm not quite sure how big the slides are on your screens, but you can see here, these are all looted bronzes lined up in the inner courtyard of the Ober's palace. And here you see some of the officers posing in front of some of their loot that you can see in the background here. Another photograph, just to give you a sense of the incredible dimension of this looting. Here are more British with bronze plaques actually all on the floor in the by now burnt down Ober's palace. And here you can see some of the bronze statues and some of the tusks and ivories. So this is all, they're all sitting literally on objects that are going to be shipped back to Britain. To this day, it's not quite known how many objects were actually seized or looted, but the numbers are in the thousands. Everybody from officers to lowly seamen had their pick and came away with a valuable piece. Here's and it even is labeled historically as loot. So this is from the personal papers of a Captain Walker, and these are these beautiful carved tusks, ivories here, and one of them ended up in the British Museum, which you can see a drawing of the archivist's keeper's card here, and here's the actual object that's in the collection. So all this gets shipped back to England, and the authorities brought brass heads and plaques and tusks to the British Museum, And most of the tusks, most of the ivories were auctioned off because in the late 19th century, they brought much higher prices than the bronze sculptures and the plaques did. The officers and sort of down the food chain in the Navy and the Army sold their booty to London dealers, for whom museums like the Pitt Rivers in Oxford and ethnography museums across Europe bought. So the Benin bronzes that are in museums across Europe came there through primarily private dealers. So as early as May 1897, so remember the punitive expedition was in February of 1897, and as early as May of 1897, objects were auctioned in London at Stephen's auction room, for example, which was followed by several sales at William Downing Webster in Bicester between 1898 and 1900. And as I said, or as I already mentioned, most of the Benin bronzes sold at auction were purchased by museums in Germany, Berlin and Stuttgart primarily, but also by Glasgow, Edinburgh, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Seattle Art Museum, and the Metropolitan Art Museum in New York. And this worldwide dispersal of the Benin bronzes was actually art historically very significant, because that witnessed or began a slow and long European reassessment of the value of West African art. And as I said, Barnaby Phillips in his book Loot does an excellent job of tracing this story and the provenance of some of these objects, where they ended up. So for example, the pendant masks I showed you earlier. I showed you this one that's in the British Museum on the left, but it is part of a pair, and the one on the right is at the Metropolitan Museum. So these are two 16th century ivory masks that were brought to England by Ralph Moore, who was the Consul General for the Niger coast. And these are, as you can see, extraordinary, beautifully pieces. They are representations of the human face. The head is crowned with you can't probably see it because it's too small, but this here is a circle of European heads, so carved European heads inlaid with copper alloy. And there is beautiful decorative lattice work that represents the ruff below the chin. And here the ruff is actually made up of more heads. And the two vertical bars that you see right here incised into the forehead are inlaid with iron. And you can just see these carved for sacrificial marks above each eye. And there is iron inlay around the eye, and again the pupils in and of themselves, I think you can actually see it better in this one right here, are inlaid with iron. And these were intended to be suspended from loops. You can see the loops right here on each side of the faces. There's the loops right here. So a rope was to be slung through it, and then they were suspended from a belt, hung from a belt. Both masks were originally bought by the famous professor of ethnography, Charles Seligman, at the London School of Economics, who then sold one, the one on the left, to the British Museum, and his widow later sold the other to Nelson Rockefeller in 1958. And William Fagg, curator of African ethnography at the British Museum at the time in 1958, described the mask as, quote, the finest and most valuable Benin, or indeed West African antiquity, still in private hands in the world, unquote. And this very mask was actually used, this is just an aside, for when Nigeria hosted the World Black and African Festival of Art and Culture in 1977. You can see it was on the cover of Festac, which was the publication that accompanied the festival. And their Foreign Office actually asked the British Museum to loan the mask to Nigeria, but the museum declined on the grounds that the ivory was cracked and the mask was too fragile to travel. And this, as you can imagine, did not go over particularly well with the organizers of the World Black and African Festival of Art and Culture. And there was quite a bit of coverage in the Nigerian press because they made it very clear that they felt that this claim that the mask was too fragile to travel was disingenuous and indeed insulting. So the debate around where these Benin bronzes should reside, who has the rightful ownership, should they be repatriated to Nigeria, has gained serious critical momentum in recent years, as has really the question of returning cultural objects that have come into European collections through a colonial context in general. So we've really had a lot of, how should I say, we've thought about it very carefully. In recent years, there's been a lot of press coverage of the issue, but it actually goes back, this call for repatriation actually goes back 40 years, if not longer. And between 1978 and 1982, European politicians, journalists, museum curators, and members of the cultural heritage sector were engaged already in a serious discussion around finding potential ways in which some of these artifacts could be, quote unquote, dealt with. And this had come out of course, 1960, the African year, when 18 colonies achieved independence and joined the United Nations General Assembly, and repatriation of cultural heritage was on the agenda. So what I'm saying in an overly complicated way here is that although the Benin bronzes have hit the press recently very loudly, this has a long, long prehistory. So this is not a new debate. It's a revisiting of a debate with hopefully a more, in my view, a better resolution. In the 1990s, the question of repatriation of the Benin bronzes was raised again. And there was a case to be made because they had been appropriated as booty taken in part to defray the cost of the punitive expedition. Critics saw the appropriation as a symbol of imperialism. And the Benin bronzes were seen as cultural hostages that had been severed from their cultural context that gave them meaning. And this discourse was advanced and really put into the public domain by Bernie Grant, who was the British MP for Tottenham in London, and who was also the chairman of the African I'm stumbling over this word today, repatriation movement. And he raised the issue of the many bronzes in British museums in 1997, which of course, as you will recall, is the centenary year of the war. So the sort of 100 years since they had been looted. And he was in 1997 supported by the Oba of Benin's family in Nigeria, who wrote a letter of authorization for Grant's request. So the request to return the Benin Bronzes. And here is Bernie Grant right here. And Glasgow Museums was caught up in the claim. And since I'm a lecturer at Glasgow University, I wanted to bring my sort of Glaswegian context into this lecture. Bernie Grant came to Glasgow to make the case with Glasgow Museums for the restitution of 22 Benin bronzes that had most likely come from the 1897 punitive expedition. And Grant's key argument really was that the Benin bronzes were stolen at a time when the major European powers carved up Africa into spheres of influence, and that these power relations continue to exist to the very present day. And the retention of the artifacts, any artifacts having emerged from this colonial context, but the retention of the Benin bronzes in this context really perpetuated and endorsed inequality. And more fundamentally, I think at the heart of the repatriation claim, as it was articulated by Bernie Grant, lies the argument around identity politics. The argument that he made that objects like the Benin bronzes have identity-affirming properties that embody a group or indeed a national identity. So what he said is, and I quote from the slide here, so this is Bernie Grant making the case for repatriation. He said that they belong to a living culture and have a deep historic and social value, which goes far beyond the aesthetic and monetary value which they hold in exile. And just pay attention to the language, hold that the value they hold in exile, right? This idea of hostages, the artifacts being held hostage in European museums. He goes on to say that for many years now, there has been a demand for these religious and cultural objects to be returned to Benin, and as the centenary of their looting approaches, the strength of feeling around this has intensified, unquote. And that's taken from the Glasgow Herald in January 1997. So that's one position. It is the idea that these objects belong to the culture from which they emerged, and they are cultural hostages that need to be returned. This position, as you can imagine, has been critiqued by a number of commentators, including the scholar Tiffany Jenkins, who wrote, and I quote here, "The visual aesthetics of the Benin Kingdom was formed in a specific historical period by a particular people, but also developed in relation to outsiders. The people of Benin traded with European peoples, the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British, and this shows in their artwork, both what they were about and what they were made out of." And recall here that the bronze, the copper, was actually derived from the melting down of the bracelets that the traders brought into Benin. James Kuno, the former director of the Art Institute of Chicago, sees the repatriation argument bound up with nationalist, retentionist cultural property laws that, as he says, serve the interest of one modern nation at the expense of the rest of the world. And in his publications where he discusses antiquities in general, and he is actually writing much more about the Elgin marbles and the demand by Greece to return them from the British Museum. So in discussing antiquities in general, he wrote that, and I quote, ancient artifacts of time and cultures long preceding the history of the modern state are really should be accessible to the world at large, as he would argue. So we've got two very opposed positions here. And in the case against the restitution, I think what is conveniently not addressed in any of these opinions or these assessments is, of course, the fact that, or the question of how the Benin bronzes were acquired, quote unquote, in the first place, namely through punitive looting. And this is what has led activists, well, he's a curator, so he's not an activist, but Dan Hicks, who has taken a very clear stand in favor of the return of these objects. He demands that it is time for European museums to atone for their complicity in the colonial past, to transform themselves into what he calls sites of consciousness, and to, quote, take action to make the 2020s the decade of restitution, unquote. So as you can see, the parties here are at a deadlock. And I wanted to present both sides to you. I wonder if there might be potentially, and I'm not advocating them, I'm just putting that out there, are there potentially other opportunities for an exchange of goodwill on both sides? And some commentators who have engaged in these debates recently have argued for a symbolic transfer of ownership to the Nigerian state, with a concession of the objects then being loaned back to London and elsewhere. And it is along these lines that the French Senate approved the return of 27 artifacts looted from the palace of Abomey in West Africa in 1892. And Macron, President Macron, did not insist on the wholesale return of these artifacts, but the idea was that the Musée Quai Branly opened, as I already mentioned earlier, this satellite institution in West Africa and mounts temporary displays of African masterpieces from French collections. Now, that language in and of itself is something we need to be very mindful and careful of, because it is African masterpieces from French collections that are being loaned back to the origin countries. So it's a very, we have to be very sort of in tune with how these gestures of repatriation are actually offered and phrased and articulated. So to close, at present, there are about 500 Benin bronzes in Nigerian museums. They were predominantly acquired during the 1950s and 1960s by colonial curators. And when the oil boom hit in the 1980s, the Nigerian government was able to buy more Benin bronzes at auction. So I think we need to await the fate of the Benin bronzes in collections in America and in Europe. And for now, we have the 100 Benin bronzes from federal museums in Germany slotted to return to Nigeria next year in 2022. Thank you very much. All right, so I think we have a bit of time for discussion. I made it purposely 11 o'clock, and we can discuss really anything that's come up over the past 3 days. It doesn't have to be restricted to today's Benin bronzes. If any questions have arisen over the past 3 days, or anything you want to share with the rest of the group, I'm more than happy to provide this as a forum. And I also wanted to mention that I have put into the chat, sorry, I should have mentioned that at the beginning of the lecture. I was doing a bit of research on something else yesterday, and I came across an interview by the Shoah Foundation on YouTube, an interview of Maria Altmann. Remember, she was the heir of Adele, the niece of Adele Bloch-Bauer, who had managed to get the Woman in Gold, Klimt's painting, back. And there's an hour-long interview on YouTube where she talks about growing up in Vienna. She's born in 1916, so when the Nazis came into power, she was in her early 20s. So it's a wonderful interview, and you get a sense of just how determined a woman she is. So it's not so much about her restitution case, but it is about her really role as a Holocaust survivor, making a new life in Los Angeles, and having grown up as an assimilated Jew in Vienna in the early 20th century. It's a fascinating history. So that link to the YouTube video is in the chat. If you're interested, just cut and paste it, and then you'll have it. Or if you don't cut and paste, then just type in Maria Altmann Shoah, SHOAH, interview, and you'll find it. Any comments or questions, I'm more than happy to respond to. So if anyone is interested, there's a newish Australian podcast called Stuff the British Stole, and it covers some really fascinating things, including the Benin Bronzes. Okay, great. Podcasts are always good.
Bean, if I had to put you on the spot, what would you suggest the British museums do?
Okay, you're putting me on the spot, and I'm going to respond honestly. I think those bronzes, those objects, need to go back to where they were looted from. I know that there is a lot of problems with how will they be housed? What are the sort of facilities that they can go into? But my opinion is that they need to go back.
But I suppose if that starts a precedent, Greece and the Elgin marbles, what would be left in British museums and German museums if this were the precedent?
Yeah, and I think this is where the heat needs to be taken a little bit out of the debate, and where hopefully there can be some arrangements made where the ownership and some of the physical objects are returned, but where loans can then be made back to major institutions, so that access to people from across the world is still possible. So we're talking about two things, I guess. We're talking about the legal ownership being returned to the source countries, and the physical objects. And I think those two debates need to be separated a bit. And I think in an ideal scenario, we would still have some of these objects in the British Museum and in other important museums across Europe on loan from the countries who have the legal ownership back. But of course, with the Benin bronzes, it's very complicated, because they were looted from the Oba, from the royal family, and it's the Nigerian government, the Follow government, that wants them back. So that's where the law in Britain is trying to sort of find the loophole.
Thank you very much. And I was also just interested, the Rosetta Stone, has Egypt ever approached the British Museum to return that?
I don't actually know, Robert. That's an interesting question. I have not heard about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't. I've something to find out. I don't know, to be honest. Libby just had a wonderful suggestion of a book called Who Owns History by Jeffrey Robertson, which really is interesting. I would second her recommendation if you want to delve into this whole issue a little bit more deeply around, actually the title says it, Who Owns History. It's a very good book. Thank you very much, Libby.
Just a small point. I have a small collection of African masks that I've collected that I like. I like them because of their artistic, they appeal to my artistic sense. I'm a bit of an amateur artist. Now, I bought them. So now who owns them? You know, yeah. I bought these in Namibia. I bought them in Johannesburg. I bought them in various different places. It becomes a little bit of a query. Can you throw anything on that? Thanks.
Well, I'm not a legal expert. I guess I would say from my take on things, it depends who. I mean, you have legal title to those because you purchased them versus the Benin Bronzes having been looted and stolen. So I guess my question back would be, we'd have to find out where the people who sold the masks to you, where they got them from. Were they made for the market? Were they masks? I mean, when I come to South Africa, I go to markets and I buy masks as well. So were they made by craftsmen for the market, or were they actually? So I guess my slightly wobbly answer would be, it depends where the masks had originated from before you bought them. I mean, that then brings it back to yesterday's lecture a little bit as well, and ties it up with a question we had in the first class that I didn't really answer. Will people who bought a painting in good faith be compensated for a painting having to be restituted? And the answer is no. So yeah, I think that would be my, but I'm certainly not advocating that we shouldn't be collecting indigenous artifacts from across the world. It's just how do they come to market, and what is the backstory of them, would be my take.
Of course, we have no idea whether it's been looted or purchased or whatever. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Sabine.
Thank you. Okay. That's really wonderful. Thank you, Nadine. That is great. So there have been requests made to the British Museum for the Rosetta Stone, but she says, Nadine is a female name, isn't it? That not quite sure what the recent effort is. So thank you. Great.
Hi, it's not actually a question. I just thought I'd quickly tell you our little family experience. On my uncle's side, we have a relative who was General White, who part of the colonial British Army was in South Africa and Ethiopia. And no one really knows the circumstances, but he ended up with some rather lovely beads, which his wife used to wear. And they came eventually, they were in the almost like the dressing up box of my aunt for her daughters. And it worried the daughters. And one of the daughters, the husband is Ghanaian from Accra. So they contacted the Ethiopian government, and it was absolutely wonderful. The Ethiopians said they would love these beautiful necklaces back. And Katie and Georgina went to Addis, and they now are housed in the university museum. The university has a kind of display, actually a lovely museum. I really recommend it. One of the most charming museums I've ever been to. And it was lovely. They wanted them back. They're being looked after. It's where they should be. I mean, they shouldn't be anywhere else but in Ethiopia.
What a lovely story. Thank you, Jane.
Things are happening, yeah.
Lovely. Wow, that is really, that is wonderful. And they have a home now again.
Goodbye, everyone. Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.